That's very cool. I don't have anything as nice as that. I just have window stuff.
Well, he's 6, so we had to use watercolors.
What does it say?
It says heart all neighbors, no racism. And then he drew animals because his whole world is he's 6 and he loves animals and his lens is animals. And all by himself, I'm gonna get emotional, he drew different animals and he drew a bee and a rat and a kind of bird. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. You know, why did you choose that? And he said, these are animals that are really important and people don't understand them and sometimes hate them.
Yes. Yeah, all of them. Bees especially.
Well, we're reading The Rats of Nim, so that's also.
Oh, yeah.
So
That's awesome.
It was kind of nice. Yeah. You know, the little you do where you are.
Yeah, this is definitely a learning moment for our children. I'm trying to read up. I started reading again Angela Davis's check 1, 2. I don't see Marina and Jessica. We should probably be on. Jessica, can you turn your video on? Because I'm getting and the audio as well. So we're going to introduce, each one of us will introduce each other briefly. Okay. Well, thank you for coming to this panel. I'm thrilled to be joined by Marina Citrin and Jessica Gordon-Nemhard. This panel is called Workers Taking Over Companies and Converting Them to Cooperatives in Argentina, Lessons for Economic Justice and the Social and Solidarity Economy. Inspired, I guess, by the publication of my book in recent months. This is a Canadian Association of Studies in Cooperation, CASC, and ANSWER joint panel. And I want to thank the Federation for the interdisciplinary fund that enabled the panel to happen. So I thought we would briefly introduce one and each other separately, and then I will do the opening remarks, followed by Jessica and Marina. So I'll just say that I am Marcelo Vietza. I am assistant professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, the program in Adult Education and Community Development. And I do work on workplace learning and change, social change, and the social and solidarity economy as well. And I teach on those subjects as well.
Hi, I'm Jessica Gordon-Nemhard. I'm professor of community justice and social economic development at John Jay College, part of City University of New York. And I'm the author of a book called Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. Sorry, it's a long subtitle.
Yes,
I think we all like to do that, don't we?
Yeah, mine is too. So I'm really thrilled to have Jessica, and that was for many reasons that I wanted to have Jessica here, and that's one of them.
Thanks.
Thanks,
and
Jessica.
I'm a member of CASC. I'm also a member of CASC.
Yes, thanks, Jessica.
Hi, I'm Marina Citrin, and I'm a professor at Stony, sorry, that's where I went to school, in sociology at Binghamton, which is where I am now. And I've done work also on autogestión, self-organization, and did a book called Horizontalidad, and it's about kind of an oral history of the struggles in Argentina after the popular rebellion, and some other work in a book, another one on Argentina called Everyday Revolutions, and some other things I'll talk about in our discussion. It's great to be here.
Which is the other reason why I wanted to have Marina here. Both Marina's work and Jessica's work have been foundational for my thinking around some of the things that we'll be talking about today. So this is great. I thank you so much for doing this. So I am going to now share the screen. I do have a PowerPoint presentation. It'll take about 20 minutes, hopefully. And I'm going to be basically reviewing, doing an overview of my book, which will be the launch pad for the discussion that we're going to have afterwards for the comments that Marina and Jessica will give, and that inspired, I guess, today's panel. So our panel today is inspired by Argentina's Empresas Recuperadas por sus Trabajadores, or Worker Recuperated Enterprises. I'm going to call them ERTs. So if I mention ERTs, that's what I'm talking about. ERTs emerge from capitalist firms in trouble via workers' own motivations and efforts. Workers in deep conflict with former owners or working in failing firms, and together with their livelihoods at risk, take over and convert their former employers' businesses to worker co-ops. So they're part of what I've called elsewhere the new cooperativism. I've been working with Argentina's ERT since 2005. I even worked at one of them actually for about a month as a student intern, and mostly getting in the way actually, but that's where I met Marina at Chilever back in 2005. This book, Worker Self-Management in Argentina, Contesting Neoliberalism by Occupying Companies, Creating Cooperatives, and Recuperating Autogestión, published a few months ago, is a result of my research and theorizing on workers' self-management in Argentina. And it's research and theorizing that begins with the voices of the ERT workers, their ideas, their practices, and their creativity. At one level, the book is a micro-sociological, political, economic project, situating the ERTs materially and historically in Argentina's labor, cooperative, and militant traditions from below. At another level, the book is also an oral labor history and a micro-sociological labor process-based account of the lived experiences of those workers from over 60 interviews that I conducted, case studies, and many ERTs I visited over the years. The book ultimately develops a social theory of autogestión. It's a radical notion of worker self-management and new forms of worker cooperativism. The main question for today is, what lessons can today's struggles for economic justice and the social and solidarity economy learn from these worker struggles that first emerged during another moment of neoliberal crisis in 2001 in Argentina? Crises are moments of potentiality for another reality, to paraphrase Herbert Marcuse, are writing in another tumultuous decade in the 1960s. More recently, Naomi Klein said, crisis blows open the sense of what is possible. And Elizabeth Drabble, in her book, The Middle Ground, wrote, anything is possible, it is all undecided. So crises are ruptures and openings. Crises, as we are seeing today with the two viruses undergirding our current moment, the COVID-19 virus and the systemic and supremacist racist virus, place into relief the contradictions of the capitalist system, but can also stimulate a contagion of resistance and alternative proposals. So my research over the years saw me visit ERTs in Argentina that emerged from out of crises. And I spent time with 4 of them. I spent more time with 4 of them. Artes Gráficas Chilaver is a 14-member print shop in the city of Buenos Aires. From a workplace of 50 employees during its heyday in the 1980s, its 9 remaining workers would spend 8 months occupying the shop, sleeping next to their printing machines, and facing off against state repression in 2002 to defend their place of work after the former boss fraudulently declared bankruptcy. Assisted by their neighbors and other ERTs at the time, they would become a cooperative later on in 2002. They are now a beacon of the ERT movement as one of the first shops to open up their space to local community projects. Unión Solidaria de Trabajadores, or UST, is a 99-member waste management and construction firm in the province of Buenos Aires, 10 kilometers south of the capital of Buenos Aires. UST emerged from a public sector contractor owned by Argentina's largest multinational, Techin. After 25 years of managing and restoring the massive 40-acre waste dump where it is located to an ecological park, and after threats of losing their livelihoods forever, the workers took over the establishment and created a cooperative in 2004. They still manage the ecological park and have created a hub of local community activity. Comercio Justicia is a newspaper in the city of Córdoba. It converted to a co-op. It was converted to a co-op by their journalists, by the journalists and print shop workers, after the former owners sold the paper off to a Brazilian multinational equity firm, which then declared bankruptcy fraudulently. This is a common occurrence at the time in Argentina. This is the first recuperated newspaper in Argentina. There are about 10 of them now. And the first where the workers bought out the firm from the former owners rather than rely on expropriation. I'll explain that in a minute. And Cooperativa Salud Junín is a once private health clinic also in Córdoba. It was taken over by 25 of its mostly female nurses on the very eve of December 1920, 2001, the moment of the people's uprising in Argentina with the collapse of the neoliberal system, the temporary collapse. After a year of not receiving salaries and then several months of occupying the clinic, Salud Junín became a co-op in 2002 and is now an innovative neighborhood health clinic, taking care of the needs of people working in the informal and gig economy with a sliding scale and unique form of community insurance that many places around the world could actually emulate right now. Salud Junín's nurses and former maintenance staff make up their members, and they work with 60 doctors from around Córdoba who donate their medical services in part and then receive part of the community insurance. So Argentina's ERTs emerged at around this time. They still continue to emerge. There are around 400 of them right now, probably a bit more. These are 2018 figures, and between 16 and 18,000 workers currently within this movement. They emerge from a defensive struggle to a proactive, offensive project of worker self-management. They are inversely related to the GDP. That is, when the GDP goes down, these emerge. When crisis happens, they emerge. They are solutions to a certain degree to economic downturns. They show tenacity, the tenacity of workers and locally rooted economies. They underscore research also in cooperative studies indicating that co-ops tend to form in times of crises, and they survive crises very well. ERTs are present in all urban economic sectors and across Argentina's national territory. Interestingly and tellingly, the largest group of ERTs are in sectors represented by Argentina's historically most militant unions. So how did they emerge? Why in this particular conjuncture? So throughout the 1990s, Argentina embraced a series of neoliberal policies that included privatizing much of its public sector services and assets, fixing the peso to the US dollar, deregulating barriers to direct foreign investment, and dismantling long-established labor guarantees. Ostensibly, this was designed to curb the hyperinflation of the late 1980s and kickstart a floundering economy. The results of these policies actually were very counterproductive. By the mid-1990s, capital began to flow out of Argentina, and local SMEs, or small and medium-sized enterprises, became very uncompetitive. How did SME owners react? Well, as bankruptcies continued, mass layoffs and unemployment rates soared to record levels throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s. And business owners, often because of incompetence, often because of overcommitment, and often in collusion with court trustees, began to engage in nefarious asset stripping schemes to stay afloat or to seek the benefit personally from insolvencies. And an increasing number of workers began to see through this from a broad cross-section of Argentina's urban-based economy and began taking matters into their own hands in light of the fact that other recourses for protecting their livelihoods were not possible. By the early 2000s, more and more threatened workers collectives would occupy companies, clinics, factories, and workshops that had employed them, setting them to work once again as co-ops. How did working people respond to this moment? Well, starting around 2 decades ago, a two-folded movement of resistance and renewal brought together Argentina's myriad social justice groups. On the one hand, this was a broader movement of protest by rebellious subjects who had had enough of the corruption, capital flight, and catatonia of the neoliberal juggernaut. On the other hand, it was a massive bottom-up project of reconceptualizing life along more democratic and socioeconomic arrangements. The social justice movements enveloping Argentina at the turn of the millennium emerged from the growing systemic cracks of the neoliberal model that had been festering for decades. As the cracks broadened and compromise constituted power's hold on the nation's frayed fabrics of social compromise, rebellion and alternative experiments from below contagiously expanded and began to spill through the cracks with compelling socioeconomic alternatives. The turn of millennium social movements would effectively choke the main organs and arteries of neoliberal capital. With no bosses to rail against or workplaces to strike, the piqueteros, or the organized groups of the growing masses of the unemployed, would go on to cut off the main distributive veins of capitalism by occupying Argentina's national roads, barricading themselves in. The piqueteros would temporarily shut down the distribution of commodities and recuperate the pavement for places of horizontal organizing. The ERTs, in turn, would seize the factories, capitalism's sites of production, and reconstitute them as open spaces for communal production. In the process, as I will touch on shortly, they also recuperated workers' capacities to control their labor and co-produce social wealth. Neighborhood assemblies would occupy the sites of reproduction of life and labor in public spaces, including local parks and plazas, and create people's assemblies, contesting the failing state's grip on power by recuperating directly democratic processes for local governance. At the same time, they were also refuting representational government and state authoritarianism. And local barter clubs and alternative currencies would directly challenge the circuits of finance and exchange, capitalism's main channels of accumulation. I have drawn theoretical inspiration from British Marxist historian E.P. Thompson and Argentine activist and historian Guillermo Almeida to understand how Argentina's grassroots rebellions and reinventions were driven by what I term a moral economy of work. Spearheading the emergence of ERTs, for instance, workplace occupations swelled as the exploitation of workers experienced on shop floors became increasingly visible and intolerable to them. As labor contracts were explicitly violated by employers via intensification of work, wage cuts, and mass firings, and as the political economic system, which had delivered the workplace security and social benefits in the past, evaporated in this neoliberal moment. both of these aspects of the turn of millennium labor struggles and social movements as counteroffensives and as creative experiments were embedded in the collective cry of fury heard around the world during Argentina's mass uprisings of 1920, December 2001. Que se vayan todos. That is, everyone in the political and economic establishment, leave now. Implicit in this slogan was the twofold practices of rebellion and prefigurative reinvention, which would bring together all of these movements for social change. Autogestión would eventually become the other side of this Janus-faced slogan, que se vayan todos. In Argentina, two further complementary concepts emerged, which Marina has actually written a lot about. Horizontality, or horizontalidad, that's to quote Marina, social relations established and sustained in non-hierarchical forms of communication, and solidaridad, or solidarity, bonds of deep solidarity and mutual aid by and for those communities, by the communities most affected. Together, autogestión, horizontality, and solidaridad, solidarity, seeds the imagination of Argentina's social movements for constituent power. Recalling the words of Herbert Marcuse, they contribute to the development of new concepts which carry in themselves the protest and the refusal of the established reality, which while guiding the creation of a new, more just reality. Evocatively articulating the three major stages needed to convert workplaces to co-ops in Argentina. Some ERT protagonists borrowed the slogan ocupar, resistir, producir, or occupy, resist, produce, from Brazil's landless workers and peasants movements. ERT protagonists would learn these three stages to autogestión collectively, informally, and in the thick of struggles to save their workplaces, or sobre la marcha, or on the path of doing, as they told me often. In the process, these workers have been recuperating the historical social memory of Argentine working class struggles, tactics, and institutions. So, for example, factory occupations, street blockades, cooperativism, activist unions, and union-based democratic shop floor organs all have a long history in Argentine labor movements and bottom-up social movements. At the turn of the millennium, these social memories and working class traditions would merge with contemporary social memories and working class traditions and practices of occupations of public spaces, experiments in collective self-provision, and local participatory democracy. One of my books and ERT workers' main concepts that we can learn from the ERT workers is autogestión. So autogestión comes from the Greek word autos, or self-same, and the Latin word gestio, or gerere, which means to manage, to gestate, more evocatively. In English, we know this inadequately, in my view, as self-management. The dialectical, critical meaning of the concept is both a defensive rebellion against some oppression, but also one of offensive prefiguration via the creation and affirmation of other social economic realities. Autogestión then was practically recuperated by the social actors across Argentina, including ERT protagonists, within and out of the struggle. One worker that I interviewed in Comercio Justicia gave me the best definition I ever read of what autogestión is. And he said this from his own experience. The possibility that we all people have to realize ourselves professionally, economically, and in our capacities to labor. It emerges from within ourselves and together with the people with whom we want to share this realization, but without sacrificing personal freedom, without sacrificing personal dignity, and from our own developmental potential. It is, in other words, about the possibility of the full development of the person. Recuperación, or recuperation, is ERT's other leading concept. By taking over and recomposing troubled firms, ERT workers recuperate their very living labor for themselves and from their bosses who had so egregiously violated the wage labor contract afforded to them by extreme neoliberalism. To recuperate is a transitive verb. To take back what was once had but had been lost. To put back into service again. To bring something back to its normal state. All apply to ERTs. It is ultimately from capital that workers recuperate their creative and productive capacities, which were literally taken away from them historically to force all of us workers to depend on the system for our survival and the capitalists' enrichment. The creative and productive capacities of the worker are fundamentally ours as human beings, and so it's ours to take back, to recuperate. So ERTs are much more than recuperating a factory. What exactly is recuperated then when workers take over and convert a firm they did not previously own or control into worker co-op? Well, fundamentally the self-valorization of their own living labor. In doing so, they democratically transform themselves, their organizations, and their work and surrounding communities. I've theorized this in my book as ERT workers' recuperative moments. And there are 6 of them that I read about in my book. And since writing it and publishing it, I've come to understand that there's 7 actually. And it's these ones. That workers recuperate their labor power. This is the fundamental commodity that's bought and sold on the labor market. It's what workers fundamentally sell of themselves. They recuperate that back. Surpluses are subdivided amongst the workers. They recuperate it for themselves. Associated labor and voluntary cooperation. The labor process, the divisions of labor, the social production of social wealth, and ultimately, as I said, workers' dignity. Overcoming crisis and struggle together intensifies these workers' sense of compañerismo, as they call it, or solidarity and camaraderie. And this is at the root of their cooperation. In turn, compañerismo acts as a social adhesive in consolidating the worker co-op and in strengthening the relations between ERTs and the community in ways unthinkable when these workplaces were managed by a boss. In the words of ERT worker at the clinic Salud Junín, we took up an ethos of esto es de todos, an ethics of esto es de todos, so this belongs to all of us. So what fundamentally happens is subjectivities are transformed. And another worker that I spent a lot of time with at Chile Verde, so did Marina, Cándido González, put this transformation like this to me. Looking back on our struggle 3 years on, I can see where the change in me started. It begins during your struggles. First, you fight for not being left on the street with nothing. And then suddenly you see that you formed a co-op and you start getting involved in the struggle of other ERTs. You don't realize it at the time, but within you, within your own self, there's a change that's taking place. You realize it afterwards, after time has passed. You start to do things that you would never imagine yourself doing. So ERTs, though, experience many struggles and many challenges still. They're still operating in ways and in part within the capitalist system. So they have to learn how to be cooperators. They weren't cooperators before. They didn't want to be cooperators necessarily. They did this out of need at the beginning. And so they have to learn how to do this. It takes time. They have to learn how to restart production, how to gather finance and capitalization, which they have a lot of trouble doing. So they have to get creative here. How to face inappropriate bankruptcy laws and lack of adequate state supports. And they've done this themselves by organizing as ERT umbrella organizations that then lobby the state to actually transform bankruptcy laws and expropriation laws to benefit workers that want to take over a failing workplace. This has been the initiative of the workers themselves. And now with the new government of Alberto Fernandez, they are proposing a new law of recuperation of productive entities that will make it even easier and address some of these challenges for workers to take over their workplaces. And in my final minutes, I'd like to talk about ERT's radical social innovations. This is how I've conceptualized what ERTs are innovating. I talk about 7 radical social innovations interspersed throughout my book, but I just want to wrap them up I want to synthesize them into 4. The first radical social innovation is social and solidarity economic practices as responses to challenges, to these challenges that I just talked about, and as reconceptualizations of production. So for example, ERTs forming collective production and marketing networks between them, recycling the waste of one ERT to be the production input of another ERT, right? Tackling several issues there, and environmental issues as well. Rethinking the concepts of efficiency and growth. What does it mean to be an efficient firm? Does it mean maximizing profits or maximizing worker well-being? Building networks of solidarity with other ERTs in barter networks, and with other social movements, and going and supporting other ERTs and cooperatives and other social movements when they're being repressed by the state or when they're under threat of eviction. A second radical social innovation is they establish more economically and socially just workplaces. For example, around 70% of them practice pretty much egalitarian pay practices, despite skill sets or despite seniority. This varies somewhat and it varies between firms, but in general, they practice infinitely more ways of sharing the revenues than they did under the former firm. Chilaver and Clinica Junin particularly practice horizontal pay equity. Other ways of creating more humanized workplaces are they're governed by democratic consensus, most of them. They have regular workers' assemblies, far and beyond the required one-year assembly of the members that's required under Argentine co-op law. They slow down the pace of what's needed. They don't take on projects if they can't handle it, if it's going to impose negatively on the lives of workers. They allow for flexible work hours. They have mate breaks. The mate is the traditional drink in Argentina that, I'm from Argentina, so that most of us drink socially. This is not minor. That within their production, here's a picture in the bottom left of the screen of a mate gourd and a pot of hot water right in the middle of the factory, right? This is not a minor point. They can take breaks, they do take breaks, and they design these breaks in working day, right? Extending the workplace into the community in two ways. They do this in two ways: by bringing the community into the workshop, by opening up spaces for cultural centers, for health clinics, for K-12, popular education, bachillerato populares, high school equivalency and K-12 education programs for marginalized communities, and in infinite other ways. So the space that's not used for production is then opened up and used for other community value and practices. And then extending the workplace into the community by reinvesting portions of their surpluses into community economic development and social and cultural development. USD was the one that I visited that did this most explicitly, actually taking a portion of their revenues and divvying it up and putting it into the development of the local neighborhood. For example, developing just and dignified housing for workers that didn't have dignified housing, and for residents of the local community, developing a sports center for youth, and a community media space. And the Eco Park itself is now a park where the community can come and participate. So ERT workers collectively call this extension out into the community La Fábrica Abierta, or the open factory. ERT workers embrace these social innovations in this concept, and in doing so, symbolically tear down the walls that contain the secret work activity of the capitalist factory by becoming community-based work and cultural organizations. And just so you don't think this only happens in Argentina, there are ERTs in Brazil, in Uruguay, in Venezuela, and Mexico, but also in the global north, in Southern Europe, and even in Canada. And here are 3 examples of business conversions to co-ops that were initiated by workers in part. And I'll just leave this on for a second so you can see. I can't get into the details of this. I have a research project now that's looking at conversions to co-ops in Canada. So that brings a close my part of the presentation. I gave you a little taste of what my book is about. For the discussion section, we can talk about how this is relevant for the current crises we're experiencing now and for the socioeconomic reality that we want to see. And I'm going to rely on Jessica and Marina to expand on this vision and to provide some thoughts as to these ideas that were initiated by the workers of Argentina's ERTs. So I'm going to minimize my screen. I think at this point, those of you that are on, well, so it's only for the 3 of us that are on Zoom. We'll put it in gallery view. And then Jessica, I invite you to share some thoughts.
Okay, thank you so much, Marcelo. I seem to be having a little bit of internet problem, so hopefully I can get through my presentation and you all can hear me. So I really appreciate being invited and participating. I'm going to first invoke the names of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, and others who we've heard so much about in the news who were murdered by police. And I want to invoke also all those who are suffering from COVID-19. And we also understand that people of color and low-income people are suffering the most from that. So I don't want us to forget the moment of history that we're in while we're also talking about all this wonderful agency and successful things that we can hope that we can do more of. And I also remind us it's not really, what's happening now is not really new. It's present for all of us. We're in a system of anti-Blackness and racial and gender capitalism that means that crises exacerbate cumulative and existing inequalities. That's why we're here. There's unfinished business that stays unfinished in these conditions. And yet we're witnessing moments in history where people have taken collective agency and individual agency to rise up to change that, to make a difference. And so I'm hopeful that this time more real difference can be made, but also from our panel that we can learn about how people did make some difference. I also always want to start by acknowledging the original stewards of the land and acknowledging all the First Nation peoples wherever we are. And I too remember my own ancestors and their continuing struggle for liberation. So I am so excited to be here because I'm a huge fan of workers' self-management in Argentina. I can't say enough about it. I only have like 15 minutes, so I'm going to focus on the connections between what Marcelo found in my own work. But I do want to make sure that you all know, and Marcelo, you know, that I think this is just a fabulous book, beautifully written. And some other time I can go through all the things that I think you did well. So to connect it to my work on African-American mutual aid and economic cooperation throughout US history, I want to look at 3 or 4 of what I think are some of the major themes from Marcelo's work. The first theme, first I'll name them all, and then I'll go through the connections that I saw between those themes in my work. So the first theme I want to talk about is this journey from the necessary economic defensive maneuvers to the proactive long-term economic democracy, solidarity, and economic agency that Marcelo has talked about. I have sort of talked about it as a movement from survival to liberation strategy. And I'll show you, I have some examples of that in a minute. My second theme I wanted to bring up is the learning by doing and the consensization. Sorry, I'm messing up these words. So the workplace and organizational learning and change that happens, the importance of collective learning, the relearning and recreating. And you'll see in a minute also that turns out to be a huge, huge theme in the work that I've done and the research that I've done. The third one, socialization and democratization of wealth, right? The creation of individual and group well-being that also simultaneously creates community assets through the pooling of resources and solidarity exchanges. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the examples I found in the histories I've done. The last theme, which I actually don't have a lot of research to support, but I think is an extremely important theme, is the one about identifying agentic capacities that develop managed employees into self-managed worker owners. And my Spanish is horrendous, so I'm using self-managed to be autogestation or whatever, but I can't pronounce it right. So I'll just say self-managed, but I hope you all know that's what I mean. I don't just mean self-managed. But that agentic behavior that changes people, right? I think it's really important for us to recognize that. Unfortunately, a lot of the experiences and research I did on African-American collectivism and cooperatives hasn't reached that point yet. I think we're getting there a little bit with New Era Windows, which is a recuperated factory in Chicago, but they're also struggling so badly financially that I think it's hard for them to officially have made that move, but they're in the process. So I want to focus on the other three themes more, but I did want, as I said, I wanted to make sure we recognize that theme as well. So the first one about that moving from survival to liberation strategy. How I sort of chronicled the African-American cooperative movement was starting with the mutual aid societies. And these really started from the 1700s, maybe earlier, maybe the whole 400+ year history of African-Americans on US soil. And what do I mean by that? I'm talking about pooling meager resources to handle everyday life, especially the things that we can't do for ourselves, right? And if you remember, African-Americans were brought to US soil as chattel slavery, right? As chattel, didn't even own our own bodies. So then controlling our economics, having any kind of wealth means nothing if you don't even own your own body. So that's the first problem. But we still have this history of starting with very small pooled resources to address burial, widow and orphan programs, health insurance, hospitalization, all that way. And then using that initial, we did it for survival, we're doing the bare minimum to actually create something bigger. So one of my examples of that is in Richmond, Virginia, late 1800s, early 1900s. There was a mutual aid society called the Independent Order of St. Luke. It was run mostly by Black women. And by the late 1800s, the board of directors was mostly Black women, and a woman named Maggie Lena Walker became president of the board. She immediately started transforming the organization into a huge, she invited more men, she got chapters, she relocated it to Virginia so that there could be a hub. They started a bank, the Penny a Day Bank, because she wanted to make sure there were banking services in the community that was controlled by the community. They then also branched up into a cooperative department store. And by the early 20th century, they basically had one of the largest Black banks in the country and had this whole interlocking system of retail, commercial retail, but owned by the Mutual Aid Society. And so that's one of the examples that you can see sort of growing from. We were first very small, just handling burials and things, and then moving into affordable housing through the bank, loans, affordable loans to people, as well as satisfying people's need even for a department store where they couldn't often shop in the white department stores. So addressing a multitude of issues with a strong infrastructure of support. And then I want to jump to the late 20th century as my second example of this moving from mutual aid to cooperativism or mutual survival to liberation. The Black Panther Party in the United States, not officially considered a cooperative, but when you look at all the, what do they call it, survival programs pending revolution, they were practicing community economics and all different kinds of solidarity, mutual aid, and cooperatives. So they developed a system, and one of the reasons I like this example is because most people only think of the Black Panthers in terms of their self-defense and the violence that they're supposed to be associated with. And yet most of what they did and most of what kept them going were these community activities and the community economics they practiced. So they provided free breakfast program, free health clinics. They made their own shoes through shoe co-ops. They made their own bread through bakery co-ops. They even had a pest control company. They had a co-op newspaper that they made money from. They shared housing. They had a transportation program to bring families to prisons to visit their relatives in prison, et cetera, et cetera. So they really had created a whole ecosystem of community cooperation and collaboration, both to keep their party alive because they had to kind of be under the radar and bring in their own income, but they also did it to support their community because they understood that while you're fighting for revolution, you have to have things in place to address the everyday needs, back to mutual aid, but you also have to put things in place for the long term, right? And to be ready for the revolution, right? So they believed in a socialist revolution. And if we weren't practicing some levels of cooperativism, socialism, solidarity, we wouldn't be ready for the revolution if and when it came. So there's that connection also with making sure we're doing the economic stuff we need, as well as the political stuff. They were actually a political party, but they believed in putting in place the economic solidarity that needed to happen in order for all the other pieces to be put in place. So those are my two examples for the first issue. The second issue, the learning by doing. This is another one which I could actually spend like 2 hours talking about, because one of the really surprising findings in my book was how important education was to the African-American cooperative movement. And what do I mean by that? When I looked back on all the co-ops that I did find throughout history, all the Black-owned co-ops, almost every single one started with a study circle, meaning people came together to learn together about what was happening to them, what kinds of alternative solutions they had, and then studied cooperatives and cooperative economics in order to make some change and to make something happen. Deliberate studying, deliberate learning together, deliberate understanding that if we don't do this together and learn together, it's not going to work, and then deliberate continuous education. So all the most successful of the cooperative efforts also talk about the continuing education, the women's guilds, the study circles that kept going even after they started, even after the first founders learned things, keeping the information flowing, doing learning journeys, going to other places that had co-ops and learning about them, including Blacks and integrated groups in the 30s going to the Antigonish to visit the Antigonish movement and learn about that and come back and bring that to the United States. So lots of different examples of learning. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll quickly give you my two examples there. These are both from the 1930s, because also I want to make connections between, as Marcelo said, things happening in economic crises that then last past the crises. And so these two are examples that happened during the Great Depression. One, Gary, Indiana, an urban example, and then I also have a rural example. So Gary, Indiana is one of my best examples of a study circle and an education program that started their whole co-op society. The Consumer Cooperative Trading Company started out where several teachers and the principal of the Black high school in Gary, Indiana come together one day around 1934 or so, because the last bank has closed in their neighborhood. No more banks are there. They don't have a gas station. They barely have any food. They're all unemployed. What are we supposed to do? And they put together a training program, an education program about cooperative economics. They actually run an official course through the night school, the adult education school at the high school. In the second year, they add a second course on co-op management and training for co-op management. And they start a study circle. The members of the study circle work together for about 18 months to put together the first co-op grocery store. That opens in 1935. Within a year, it's the largest grocery business owned by African Americans in the United States, with total sales of $160,000 per year. 1936, just picture it, just amazing what you can do. They add a credit union by the next year, a second grocery branch, and a gas station. So again, this whole notion of an ecosystem you build from one thing to the next, and you keep learning together to do that. Bricks and Terrell County schools in North Carolina, the same thing, late 1930s. Great Depression, this is a rural area. Both of those schools are independent Black schools. And they decide to start teaching co-op education, not just to their students, but to the adults, to the families, because they want to create, again, a whole co-op ecosystem to help support the school and their communities, because people are floundering and in trouble. So they start an agricultural co-op agricultural society. They start doing a buying club for supplies and foodstuffs. They start a credit union. They do machine sharing, like tractor sharing. So they buy a tractor together and then everybody shares the tractor that's needed. And they start a co-op health insurance program. Both these schools are doing a lot of this in parallel. And then they realize that they're doing it and they start joining forces. They create the Eastern Carolina Federation of Cooperatives and then a statewide North Carolina Federation. What does that have to do with education? Well, aside from them being schools themselves, one of the main purposes of the North Carolina State Federation of Co-ops for African Americans is that they created manuals and workshops to promote and develop Black credit unions and co-ops. They convinced the state agricultural department to support them and to put up the money and to disseminate the manuals that they created and to sponsor the workshops. Within a 12-year period, they went from 1936, 3 Black credit unions in the state of North Carolina. By 1948, there were 98 Black credit unions in the state of North Carolina. In addition, they helped to start 48 other co-op enterprises in the state for Blacks over that same period: 9 consumer stores, 32 machine co-ops, 4 curb markets, 2 health associations, and a housing project. So again, creating those manuals and workshops, pooling together as a team made a huge difference. And then lastly, the socialization and democratization of wealth. So this is an important one because, right, as marginal, oppressed peoples, wealth and wealth accumulation has been one of the hardest things in the Black community. And as we know, for most low-income groups, but especially racialized groups. 400 years of asset stripping, right? From not owning our own bodies to not being able to get loans for mortgages to not being able to own land or having land taken away from us, being lynched because we own land or owned our own businesses. So again, pooling our resources to help address those issues has been both a necessity, but also had become a strategy. And so we've used credit unions and other kinds of credit exchanges, all the different kinds of solidarity financing to really try to address these issues and to create not just wealth for each individual member, but a communal wealth in different ways, but especially in the ways that Marcelo already said. And to combat predatory lending with non-predatory lending, et cetera. So my 2 examples here, and then I'll quit. Oops, I am over time already. Okay, really fast. Cooperative Home Care Associates in the South Bronx from the 1980s, still existing now. It's actually the US's largest worker-owned cooperative. In addition to being a great example of taking a very low-skilled, low-income industry, home care, and making it, living wages, long-term work, et cetera. They also have a wealth creation process. So they provide annual dividends, which is most co-ops do, but because they've been able to be successful, they've been able to give back about 25% annually on your initial equity. So in 4 years, you earn back your initial equity, but you still have your equity in the business. They bank the unbanked, so all their members, they help them to bank and give them direct deposit accounts. They have retirement accounts for all member owners, and they also do match savings accounts. So they have a whole system of wealth to connect to their worker owners. And then Freedom Quilting Bee, which started in the 60s, has more unstable history in the 21st century, but in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s had a very strong history. These are women who started out with sharecropping families, very poor. Sharecropping, as you know, is total debt peonage. They used selling of quilts to get extra income, connected that to cooperation, and created a quilting co-op. Within about 5 years, they had enough money to buy land and to build the sewing plant. With the movement from working at home to working in their own sewing factory, that meant they needed to do something with their children. So they also started a child care center and after-school programs on their property. In addition to that, because they owned land now, they were also able to help other sharecroppers. They were able to help some sharecroppers to lease land from them and not have to lease it from white, unsympathetic landowners. They also allowed some sharecroppers who get evicted for registering to vote to own their own land by selling them that land. In 1992, they're the largest employer in town, as well as being landowners. And so that stability and community asset is another example. And as women, right, they're also addressing issues of youth and children with the Child Care Center. And so again, you see a blanket of solidarity kinds of activities that come out of what started out as one activity. So let me stop there.
This is amazing, Jessica. Thank you so much. Wow, there's just so much to say. But for me, the power, I think, of your work and of working with these movements is articulating the reality that already exists, right? They're not alternative; they're already existing, right? And this isn't really important in your work, and why the work, Marina's work and your work inspired mine to name these practices.
Exactly.
But also do so together with the communities in particular. That's really important.
Right,
So this
and
is,
for the communities to see that they're really what they're doing. Often they don't have the context, right? They're
correct.
just doing it, but we're
Correct.
able to give them the context, to give them language
Yes,
for it.
that's right. That's excellent. Yes, thank you, Marina. So, and also, I want to apologize for taking a little longer too. So don't worry about it, Jessica. we do have a couple of questions in the chat, but we'll get to that in a little bit.
Great. So I'll just speak for a few minutes then. I won't speak that long. Marcelo, congratulations. The book is tremendous. And Jessica, that was a really powerful and concrete, both of you, really concrete examples, which is, that's what I'm hoping we do with the last little bit of the discussion, or kind of putting it all together. And I think that's what all of us are thinking about, all of us, and probably people listening and who will listen, especially in this incredible moment, right? This moment of crises and crises. So it's pandemic, crises, and this, it's not a crisis of racism, it's bringing to the fore the police violence and the historic oppression. And so these things coming together at the same time are crises like in Argentina, and possibilities. It opens so much possibility. And this is why this discussion is so brilliant and so important right now. So many things I'd like to address. I mean, I think one just very basic thing when we have these kinds of crises is kind of the question of who are we? The story that we're told about who we are. So we are told as people certain stories. There are these narratives about who we are, and then who we actually are emerge in these moments of crisis. And so we're told, you know, the Hobbesian, we're all out to get each other and we're gonna just be out for ourselves, right? And actually, when these crises happen, it brings forward what has been going on all the time. So Jessica, what you talk about in your book, it shows that people care about one another. We work together, we use forms of mutual aid, solidarity. This is just who we actually are. And the difference, you know, in what brings those two, what brings the one more to the fore than the other, is in the times of crisis, these institutions of power, either they fail themselves, or as we're seeing in the streets, in cities throughout the United States right now, people are putting them in crisis. So you no longer have legitimacy police force, or with COVID in the United States and in so many states around the world, our national governments they're not taking care of us. And so that kind of opens a space, as horrible as that is, it also opens the space for our stories. And this is what happened in Argentina with the economic collapse, right? And I would love to kind of see what people want to talk about in the discussion here, Marcelo, as far as Argentina, because so many things happened. But I think the examples Jessica gave and Marcelo are these examples of survival together with new social relationships, new ways of being and relating to each other. So we're told this story about ourselves, and we're also told there's only one way to organize in society. And that's not true. And we know that's not true because, I don't know, my neighbors over there, I look after their kids sometimes and they look after my pet when I go away, or they'll look after my son. You know, we just do that, but we don't call that political. But actually, if we think about those relationships, those are deeply political and transformative. And this is what, you know, these examples and models kind of can show us. As far as where we go with this conversation, I think the biggest question so many people have are, well, how do we make them long lasting? Because I spent so much time in Argentina, and I spent some time in Uruguay with recuperated workplaces, and in Europe and Italy and in France and in Greece. and with lots of movements that are trying to create or are creating new social relationships, rejecting institutions of power, whether it's the form of the state or however people name it, these institutions, these systems, and creating something new. And which ones last? Which of these new relationships? And how do they last? Or how do the forms last? And sometimes it is the ways of relating continue to reemerge, but we don't necessarily form institutions or structures. And so I think what this conversation helps us to do and imagine is, those holding structures. So the economic relationships and the survival structures. And I think that's really important in thinking about this crisis moment now, because everyone's imaginations are kind of breaking open as to what's possible. It is exactly the moment to insert workers, 400 plus workplaces in Argentina, tens of thousands of people. We have been doing this historically in different places around the world. We can do this. So then the question I think comes up is kind of, how do we do this? And in the most immediate, a project I just finished working on with 20 people from around the world, 17 of whom were women. And I will note that aside from Argentina and the workplaces in particular, which are majority male for various reasons, including the type of work and history of oppression and everything else, these movements are women. They're women organized and women led in the sense of doing. A friend of mine in Bolivia often says, yes, men like to do the talking and we like to do the doing. So often you will see the face of someone who is male, but we need to say that and recognize that. Often the work we're seeing right now, for example, and historically, are people of color as well, facilitating this. So it's women of color, creating a lot of these mutual aid type structures and projects and relationships. It's the kind of care work that we, kind of relegate into an area that's not political, but it is so deeply, deeply political and revolutionary. And so this project I'm working on now, or that we just finished, is a compilation. It's a book where people interviewed people in their location who are involved in mutual aid projects, solidarity projects, care projects right now because of COVID. And so the book is called Pandemic Solidarity. But women in Iraq, in Rojava, in India, in South Korea, in Taiwan, Brazil, Argentina, all over the world. And these stories of how people are actually taking care of one another with food, on all different levels, bodies, healthcare. And one of the questions people asked interviewing around the world of everyone was, so could this be long lasting? Could you imagine these new relationships that are so transformative and actually who we are? How do we make them last? And so that's the question. That's maybe where I will even end so we can have a little bit of a conversation. I'll speak more maybe in the discussion, but to kind of throw out there what is on all of our minds and in our hearts is that, okay, enough already. We get the enough already. And what are we creating? How are we creating it? And how can it last? I love this idea of ecosystems, Jessica. So thinking about the recuperated workplaces in Argentina, but workers in Argentina would say again and again and again, we couldn't have done this without, and then they name everyone in the community, right? Which we all could learn from. None of us can do anything without all of these structures around us and systems. And that, yeah, so how do we think about that to make it the long-lasting total transformation that we all hope so that we can actually be free to be who we are?
Excellent, Marina. Thank you so much for those comments. So important. Matt, we could just spend the next couple of days talking about this. I think this is really this moment that I think all of our work, and my book came out right before the pandemic, and I see relevance today, and I see relevance for all of our work today. Because we're all covering different types of crises, different moments of crises. And this is just our particular iteration of crisis. It's endemic to, it's designed into capitalism inadvertently or by design. It's a system in perpetual crisis. And now we find ourselves in this moment. I think there's a lot to learn from these practices, and I'm so glad that your book came out so quickly. It's amazing how publication timelines are now being transformed as well, It's great. We have questions. We have a series of questions from folks that are listening in right now. So should I kind of compile some of them? And there's a group of questions around the notion of prefiguration and building a new society out of the shell of the old. And I think that kind of transcends all of our projects, that in the Black social economy, for example, that they're kind of reappropriating already established systems and then recreating them. In Argentina, they're reappropriating businesses and then creating something different out of them. In the examples that your book covers, Marina, Marina, sorry, there's these kind of moments of recreation. So it's out of the shell of the old, prefiguration. So that was one series of questions. And I'll just summarize two more. Another one is that in Canada, Sean Campbell asks that in Canada, these kind of worker-led, even cooperatives are depoliticized. They become business propositions, and they don't have the same political fervor as they do in Argentina and other places, Brazil, Venezuela, and in Black, in the Black Afro-American social economy experiences. I'm teaching a course right now in economic democracy, and what I'm trying to teach them, and we read a piece by Jessica, we read a piece by Caroline Hossein as well on the Black social economy and the need for Black epistemology. And it's about because of their entrenchment in oppression and marginalization, even creating a gas station, as you mentioned, is a political act, is an act of prefiguration, an act of autonomy, taking back the economy, right? So, but they'll have different shades, right? So anyway, so that was another series of questions. And then a third set of questions by Lori Mook. She asked about the relationship between the ERTs and the state. And I think that could go with all of our projects as well, that the state is there and it must be contended with, it must be engaged with at the same time. It's part of the problem. And so there's this tension, right? This paradox that emerges, right? So how do we want to handle these?
Can I jump in on one question, the question about businesses? Because it does come up a lot, like how to work a cooperative, and people often think about food cooperatives in their neighborhood when they think cooperative, and that what we're talking about is this idea of autogestión, so it's self-organization. But there's still, of course, that danger because it's under capitalism. So creating a different value kind of construction within a capitalist framework. And one of the things that I think, and I'd love to hear both of what you think, but from what I've observed is the relationship to the community. How deeply embedded, not just embedded, but that it becomes a part of the community. So for example, in Greece, there's a workplace called Viome. And I spent a lot of time there, actually. It's right around Thessaloniki. And they've actually an interesting story that I can't go into too much in detail, but they were deciding, they had occupied it and they were deciding whether or not to recuperate. It's the first such workplace in Greece. They weren't sure what to do. And it was by chance, I met someone, I'd been spending time there working on something else. So I shared with them some stories about Argentina. And then through fundraising, through a whole network of people, we were able to bring a worker from Argentina to Greece who met with the workers and directly like, this is possible, you can do this. And they still reference now in Greece that was why they did it. Finally, they made that decision because they saw and spoke to like a real person so these networks are so huge and important in person. But how they organize now in Viome is they have their assembly and then there's a community assembly. Yeah. And the community assembly has an incredible influence over so many things. And there's tensions. Sometimes, there was a discussion of should they get to decide what's produced in the workplace? How ecological is the workplace? So many of the workplaces, once they're taken over, become much more ecological, and it's the struggle. And then the last little bit about that is solidarity. So that's, I think, what can ground a workplace from becoming a business is it really in the community, and how much say is there? I think we can re-envision this like in Greece. And as a note, right now, Viome they've been producing soaps, among other things, with olives from Greece. They've been donating this soap to the refugee camps during the COVID crisis.
That's amazing. I have a confession to make. I actually, well, not confession. I didn't know that you were the one that brought VMA with Argentina together, Marina. I actually talk about that situation in my book, but I didn't mention your name. I just mentioned that
Don't mention my name. Don't mention my name. It was just a happenstance.
Yeah, but I mentioned, and the transnational links of solidarity that are emerging. I'm a part of, and Marina's too, a part of this international network of what we're calling the workers' economy, and broadly defined. And in Spanish, it's gender. There's trabajadoras and trabajadores, and so we are now calling it trabajadoras es. This is a problem in Spanish. You can't really speak a gender neutral language. So anyway, but it's broadly defined. It's really bridging all these different experiences together. Actually, Jessica, you're in Mexico too. Were you not in Mexico, Jessica, last year? Yeah,
I was for the workers' economy.
Yeah, for the workers' economy. And this started back in 2007 out of Argentina, out of the ERTs, and out of solidarity, workers from the university, actually working in researchers from the university working in solidarity with them. And what this has done, and what this kind of underlines, is the importance of these stories being shared, the experiences being shared. And that's what this network is doing. I mean, there are infinite other numbers of networks in Argentina and everywhere, that are informal, that go unrecognized, and where these experiences, where the learning happens. And this is what, when I write about informal learning, this is what it means, not outside of the classroom, but rooted in practice, and then rooted in learning from others, and others coming together in solidarity. So the notion of solidarity is really, really, really important as an ethical political position. So yeah, and Jessica, do you have anything to add to
Yeah,
this?
I wanted to jump in on a couple of things. First of all, yeah, the international exchange of ideas. As I said, I found that in the Black experience too, with going to Antigonish, but also in the 1930s, one of the radical Black churches actually brought the foremost Japanese cooperator to Harlem to talk about co-ops. So, we've been doing that. We've been doing this as much as we can all the time. The Puerto Rican co-op movement says Father Cody came to Puerto Rico, San Juan, and that's what kind of spurred that movement. And that's a very strong movement as far as I'm concerned. So there's lots of interesting stuff with these learning journeys and exchanging of ideas and stuff. I also wanted to piggyback on Marina about and you started it, the importance of community. I didn't say it in my presentation, and I think this is also important for the longevity. Again, the periods of time where I found the most Black co-ops and the co-ops that lasted the longest all can hearken to the connection that they had with community, right? The fact that community supported them, community bought from the co-ops, community understood what the co-ops were trying to do, community did everything they could to be supportive. Those are the places that had the strongest, most long-lasting, and in return, the co-ops gave back to community, helped to develop them, gave money for affordable housing, gave money for the kids' sports teams, just from every range of what kind of giving back to community could be. And also for the African Americans, and I assume I think it's actually the same for all the other cases you guys have too, protecting the co-op members. And for African Americans, the story I didn't get to tell because I was trying to stay on the positive side of stuff is the sabotage and the white supremacist violence against cooperators. So not just against Black people, but also Black people who are trying to do something different in the economy, from lynchings to burning down the co-op building to not allowing banks to give a line of credit, the whole gamut of all kinds of sabotage. And it was communities, when communities stood in front or stopped the lynching or stopped the the financial sabotage, that's what also helped these co-ops. So I think that's one of the things we have to think of when we think of longevity. We need to make sure the project also includes community dialogue, community understanding, and community support, because that's essential, right? And even if you're not a member, right, to believe that the co-op is part of you, part of your community, and to understand that relationship, I think is really important. However, we have to do that. The other thing that turned out to be really important in the Black example, and I'm not sure if you found this in Argentina, was again, the period of time that I found the most Black co-ops were the period of the strongest Black organizations that were also, and each organization was also promoting co-ops, even if they were doing it quietly and under the radar. But when you look, when you sort of match up the long civil rights movement and what civil rights organizations, what these different mutual aid and religious organizations were doing, in the periods that we have the most co-ops, we had strong organizations talking about cooperatives and training people about cooperatives. And so making sure it's in the dialogue, making sure there were opportunities for education. And the interesting thing in the Black community is those same organizations turn out to be the largest Black organizations during that same period in history. So they're large, significant organizations, even if it's not their main purpose or mission. Most of the time it wasn't what they were known for even, but it turns out when you look at them, that their leaders and their activities are doing co-op development and that kind of thing. So I think, again, that was relationships are important.
Sorry, Jessica, it's 5:12. I'm conscious of the time. I'm wondering if we could we go like a few minutes over just so we can wrap up these thoughts? I hope so.
I'm fine. I have no idea if our Zoom is going to be turned off or not.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It might be a hard cut, but I just want to say it's 5:12 and it's supposed to be about 5:15 and we're not in, anyway. So I wanted to say quickly that in Argentina with the ERTs, it wasn't so much co-ops, it was a militant and participatory labor movement. That these organs, there is a long history in Argentina of organizing democratically on shop floors in like Ford, at Renault, right? These are militant workspaces with workers' commissions and shop stewards movements. And there was already the spirit of democracy on shop floors from the bottom-up labor movement that actually the labor bureaucracy never intended necessarily, but workers, because of the anarchist and historically socialist European roots of contemporary labor movements in Argentina. So that's where it comes from. When the ERTs started to reach like a critical mass, they had a couple of meetings. They had a few meetings, and so what do we do? Well, the first idea was, let's nationalize. Let's tell the government of Dualde at the time to nationalize and under workers' control. Well, yeah, that didn't go very far. So then they quickly identified, well, the co-op movement actually is really rich and has a long history in Argentina as well. Actually, really linked to the Socialist Party, the co-op movement, and labor as well. And so one of the largest co-ops in Argentina, it's been around for 100 years, and what's gone through some trouble, is called El Hogar Obrero, or the workers' house, and it took care of a multitude of social needs of workers for over a century. And so they had this knowledge already, and that's how they seized on the cooperative. Initially it was just out of needing like something to organize themselves around, and then actually having this space then actually having a legal framework under which to organize. So I think we're being called to a close. I didn't have a chance to talk about.
Right, 5:20. We've got 5 more minutes.
Oh, great! That's excellent. Okay, I wanted to quickly talk about the state, and maybe we can talk a little bit about this. Interestingly, the ERTs have had a checkered relationship with the Argentine state. So remember, they started under the government of Menem in the 90s, and then De la Rua. These were intensely neoliberal, kind of anti-worker governments in many ways. So they were merging at the time. It was they were organizing, defensively, and so they weren't really organized as a movement yet. And then it moved to the government. So very kind of a relationship of contestation, where the state repressed, right? Property laws were enforced. And then when they organized, when they had enough mass and they organized under umbrella organizations, They started to then take a dual approach with the state. You lobby the state for the rights that are embedded in the Argentine Constitution, right? The right of dignified work for all Argentines. They actually use this, right? They actually use this for their arguments. And so the right to dignified work in a situation where there was 30%, 20 to 30% unemployment. So their argument was, look, we're not going to go on the unemployment dole. What we're asking is for us to keep on working. Give us the factories. Let us take the factories. Don't repress us, and let us work the factories. And so they managed to, their lawyers of the movements, of the National Movement of Recovered Enterprises and others, managed to convince judges to then cede these spaces based on this constitutional right. And then sympathetic legislators started to then expropriate them using provincial and national expropriation laws. So in the States, it's called eminent domain, right? Where this is a public good. And so the state expropriates this bankrupting firm and cedes it to the workers, and the workers then pay it off over 20 years. No workplace has ever paid it off yet. It's still under debate as to how it happens. And so the workers managed to articulate this and then work fairly in a fairly sympathetic way with the Kirchner governments, the 15 years under the Kirchner regimes, although there was a lot of words but little action. And now with the Macri regime, it was back to repression. And the way that they did this, the neoliberal regime of Macri, the way that Macri did this was jack up the utility rates. So the utility subsidies that the Kirchner governments had put in place to help all Argentines. Macri quickly got rid of that. Utility rates went up, and these businesses, some of these ERTs almost didn't make it. Most of them did survive. And now they're actually in government. Now with the government of Alberto Fernandez, there's a new directory of, or a secretariat of ERTs with none other than Eduardo Murua, who's one of the original leaders, as the head of the secretary. And they're also very present in INAES, which is the Social and Solidarity Economy, or the Cooperative Federation, or it's not the federation, it's the government arm that oversees co-ops. So now there's more of a dialogue happening, but we'll see. There's now this in Argentina, this legislation for productive entities is now being proposed, initiated by the ERT workers as well. So they've really managed to punch well above their weight, right? Their numerical weight. But we only have a couple of minutes left, Marina.
No, I was just going to tack in there. No, it was a really great detailed description of the kind of the relationship with the state, and all of the workers that I know anyway, and you definitely interviewed more people, I think, in the workplaces, kind of said, yes, we're working with a legislation, we're trying to do this legal piece, and we are still occupying, and we are still producing, and it's still in the community. So had they not gotten it legalized, right? And I think that part is important. Without the direct action, without actually holding production, it's a legal argument. And that's, I know that's not what you were saying. I just wanted to kind of tag that on, that it's, part of the relationship to the state is try and make sure you're doing what you need to do.
Correct.
And bending yourself and what you have. So it's kind of it's a dance or a war, depending who you talk to.
Right.
For sure.
I think it's an important point, probably a great point to end on.
Yes.
Right.
It is. I just want to thank you both for taking the time and the care to engage with my work. I'm just thrilled and I'm honored. I couldn't have.
Thank you.
I can't think of two other people to be able to do this with.
I
also want to thank. I also want to thank Congress for funding this panel. Hopefully next year we can meet again face to face in Edmonton. And I want to thank Answer. And also thank you, Jessica, for remembering to recognize the Indigenous lands that we're on. I was going to do it and I forgot. So I'm glad
we're
you
a team. It's all
right.
We're all a team.
I'm glad. So thank you so much. This will be recorded and available on YouTube, I believe, or on some channel that Answer will let you know about. I will be kind of sending out the link And so thank you very much. And may this be an inspiration to us to continue the struggle and in the current crises that we're part of now. Bye.